Knowledge begins as a small light, a curiosity that brightens a corner of the mind and refuses to go out. It is a whisper that suggests a pattern and then insists on verification. It is the quiet engine that turns questions into experiments, and experiments into understanding. And yet the first lesson of this engine is paradoxical. The more light we create, the more shadows reveal themselves. Illumination exposes texture, but also reveals the scale of what remains unlit. The mind learns to measure its ignorance in the same breath that it measures its insight. And this double measurement is not a failure, but the very mechanism that sustains inquiry. Imagine a night with a single candle placed at the center of a vast hall. The flame is small, but it lets one see steps, columns, tiles, the grain of a table. Yet for every detail newly visible, the eye notices deeper recesses of the hall, alcoves that the small lamp cannot reach, staircases that disappear into darkness, and the brain, being what it is, marks those edges as invitations rather than as dead ends. Knowledge functions as the lamp. Every answer increases the field of vision, and with that expansion come new questions about the things now seen. Knowledge therefore grows in concentric rings. Each answered question becomes a perimeter for a yet larger puzzle. This paradox is ancient, and it appears in every domain where thought touches the world. In the physical sciences, a law solved opens the door to phenomena that escape the law. Newtonian mechanics gave clarity to motion, but also revealed anomalies that required a deeper theory. Classical certainty yielded to relativistic context, and the refinement never eliminated mystery, it only reframed it. Physics moves by the interplay of explanatory power and surprising exceptions, and that interplay is a model for intellectual life, because each new framework is both a tool and a door to further complexity. In biology, the discovery of molecular machinery explained heredity in a stunning way. Yet it also revealed complexity of regulation, epigenetic layering, networks of interaction that defy simple reduction. The genetic code offered clarity and multiplied the landscape of questions. How does development unfold in time? How do networks stabilize function? How does subjective experience arise from patterned chemical signaling? The genome gave a map and also revealed the immensity of the territory it only begins to describe. History demonstrates the same form. An explanation of cause and effect in human affairs often reveals contingent patterns. The tiny decisions of individuals can tilt large systems. Institutions evolve from many micro-choices, and small misalignments can cascade into transformative outcomes. The historian learns that causality is not a single thread, but a braided rope. Every new fact both clarifies context and introduces noise, and the noise itself becomes the subject of further exploration. Mathematics exhibits a subtler version of the paradox. Axiomatic systems can produce elegant theorems and deep insight, yet Kurt Gödel reminded us that any sufficiently expressive system contains statements that cannot be resolved solely by its internal rules. Formal certainty meets formal limitation, and the mind recognizes that rigor implies boundary. The encounter with boundary is not defeat, it is revelation. It shows that systems of thought have their own topology, places where neatness gives way to necessary ambiguity, and that knowledge is shaped both by the rules discovered and by the limits those rules reveal. The paradox creates a needed humility. To know is to accept that certainty will often be provisional, that models are maps, not territories, and that clarity has the quality of a staged performance rather than of a final proclamation. This humility does not weaken inquiry, it steadies it, because the aware mind learns to treat conclusions as tools for the next question rather than as terminus points. In scientific practice, this is common. A conclusion leads to new experiments precisely because the hypothesis invited further scrutiny. And the cycle of hypothesis, test, and revision is the engine that propels understanding forward while acknowledging its incompleteness. Curiosity is the hand that keeps turning that engine. It is not simply the desire to accumulate facts. It is the hunger to reshape perception, to reframe the world so that new structures become visible. And curiosity is often paired with wonder, the emotional residue left when a pattern reveals unexpected depth. Wonder is not naive admiration. It is an effective recognition of scale, a sense that a discovery both explains and enlarges the question space. Knowledge without wonder tends to ossify into trivia. Wonder without knowledge tends to drift into sentimentality. The ideal is a blend, knowledge enlivened by wonder, wonder guided by the discipline of method. This dynamic conveys a practical implication for how thought should be oriented. Instead of fixating on accumulation, the mind benefits from orientation, from forming meta-questions that organize domains rather than gathering isolated facts. Meta-questions are efficient lamps. They structure inquiry so that new data fits into frameworks that enhance comprehension, and frameworks are valuable when they are flexible, when they accommodate anomalies rather than suppressing them. A flexible frame guides attention to the edges that matter. It highlights which anomalies suggest profound revision and which are likely to be quirks of context. The history of technology illustrates how frameworks and anomalies dance together. The engine of industrial progress was not only clever machines, it was a culture that valued the recursive loop of problem and solution, a cultural meta-question asking how efficiency could be increased. And with that meta-question came an infrastructure that corrected errors, iterated designs, scaled experiments, and encoded maintenance as part of invention. The paradox here is practical. The improvements solved immediate problems and revealed deeper systemic questions about sustainability, distribution, and values. Each solution begets new dilemmas, and the social fabric must adapt. Knowledge thus shapes ethical awareness. Once something is understood, the responsibility to act on that understanding often follows. And with understanding come questions about priorities, about which truths should guide action, and how to balance competing goods. Scientific insight into the natural world poses questions about stewardship, resource allocation, and the consequences of intervention. The more knowledge accumulates, the more intricate the moral landscape becomes because the capacity to effect change increases even as unintended consequences proliferate. Philosophy sits at the core of this elaboration because it trains the habit of reflecting on the conditions of knowing, the frameworks we use, and the values embedded in inquiry itself. Philosophy asks meta-questions about the limits of reason, about language and meaning, about the normative assumptions that guide scientific practice. It does not aim to render knowledge obsolete. Rather, it clarifies the terms in which knowledge is pursued. It makes the implicit explicit, and it helps cultivate the intellectual humility that recognizes the provisional nature of many conclusions. Creative imagination plays a complementary role. Fiction and speculative thought experiment expand the conceptual space in which knowledge operates. They craft scenarios that reveal hidden assumptions. They turn abstract possibilities into tangible narratives, and by doing so, they prepare the mind to encounter unexpected realities. Science fiction, therefore, is not mere entertainment. It is a cognitive rehearsal for futures not yet present, a way of stretching conceptual muscles so that when anomalies arrive, the mind is less shocked and more ready to respond with inventiveness. At the scale of community and society, the paradox of knowledge has civic implications. Institutions that institutionalize curiosity, ones that value method, reproducibility, open debate, and maintenance of shared knowledge, cultivate resilience against error, and capture the cumulative benefit of discovery. Conversely, societies that treat knowledge as a commodity to be wielded for narrow advantage or that suppress dissent risk stagnation. Because the paradox demands an open system in which questions are aired and errors corrected, the expansion of understanding requires a social ecology that tolerates and learns from being proven wrong. In practical life, the paradox can be reframed as an invitation to inhabit uncertainty gracefully. Mastery of a craft reveals deeper subtleties. Expertise does not bring finality, but access to subtler problems and refinements. The practitioner who embraces this is rewarded by a deeper appreciation of nuance and by a capacity for continued growth. The mind that assumes it has arrived at final truth will stagnate, whereas one that sees each conclusion as a checkpoint will continue the journey. This disposition also influences emotional life. The knowledge that certainty is provisional softens rigid attachments to identity and belief. It opens space for curiosity to operate without egoic threat. It allows one to revise convictions without distress. That flexibility is a kind of resilience, because the adaptive person can reweave their internal narrative when evidence mounts and new patterns emerge. Intellectual humility thus supports psychological stability in the face of change. The paradox of knowledge also links to time. Understanding deepens across temporal scales. Short-term experiments accumulate into long-term insights. The patient observer sees patterns that elude the hurried eye. There is a discipline to long-term thinking, an attitude that prizes sustained attention and incremental change over dramatic revelation. This temporal patience harmonizes with the paradox. If knowledge never finishes, then progress is measured by the refinement achieved over repeat cycles of observation and correction. To live within this paradox is to practice a kind of cognitive craftsmanship. It is to build models, test them, break them, repair them, and then build better ones. Each iteration increases the domain of what is understood, while also circumscribing the edges where mystery persists. The practice values precision, but it also recognizes that precision itself must be contextualized. Precision without relevance yields brittle insight. Relevance without rigor yields sloppy reasoning. The craft of knowledge balances both. With this balance comes aesthetic delight. There is a distinct pleasure in discovering a simple explanation that accounts for complexity, in seeing a pattern that reduces bewildering detail to an intelligible form. Such insights are moments of clarity that feel like glimpses of order in a chaotic landscape, and they are rewarding not because they finish the story, but because they open a new chapter. The sense of meaning comes from participating in the ongoing unfolding rather than from closing it. That unfolding is communal. Knowledge is rarely an individual artifact. It is social infrastructure, a net of interlocking discoveries that transcend any single life. Reading a theorem, using a protocol, enjoying a piece of art, these are encounters with accumulated thought across time. The paradox appears again. Knowledge is shared and cumulative, yet it always points to horizons beyond the current communal grasp. Cultures that steward their collective understanding and pass on the practices that sustain inquiry enable successive generations to ask richer questions. The mind that contemplates the paradox comes to a simple practice of orientation. Questions are chosen with care, not in order to hoard facts, but to illuminate relations. The skill is to notice which questions will produce fertile loops of feedback, which will generate testable models that refine thinking. In this way, the mind becomes more efficient, its efforts multiplied because attention is applied where it compounds. The paradox thereby becomes a heuristic for stewardship of intellectual resources. It guides where to direct curiosity so that it yields ongoing bloom rather than transient novelty. The social habitats of knowledge must be designed to sustain this process. Institutions that encourage replication, humility, and long-term thinking produce robust accumulations of understanding. Conversely, institutions that reward spectacle and quick claims without verification create brittle knowledge systems prone to collapse. The paradox exposes the need for slow institutional forms that can manage error, ensure maintenance of archives, and preserve the practices through which intellectual capital is grown and transmitted. At the level of ethics, the paradox has immediate consequence. Knowledge brings power to change systems and behaviors, and with power comes the duty to consider downstream effects. The more knowledge accumulates about cause and consequence, the more complex the moral calculus becomes. This does not paralyze action. Rather, it asks for a higher quality of deliberation, and increased attention to unintended consequences and to the moral architecture of interventions. In the language of craft, knowledge enlarges the toolkit and therefore enlarges responsibility. The paradox also points to a kind of spiritual humility that is compatible with scientific rigor. To accept the endless horizon is not to adopt nihilism. It is to stand in awe of complexity and to allow that awe to motivate careful, sustained engagement. That stance converts the existential anxiety of ignorance into the practical energy of inquiry. It converts paralysis into practice and wonder into method. Technology introduces additional inflections. Tools amplify the reach of questions. Instruments extend perception to the very small and the very distant. Computational models let minds explore virtual experiments at scale, yet tools also shift the context of knowing by changing the temporal and spatial scale at which consequences manifest. Algorithms create feedback loops that can hide or exaggerate patterns. Automation creates dependencies that change maintenance requirements, and design choices encode priorities. In a world of amplified tools, the paradox reminds that design must attend to durability, to repair, and to the distribution of epistemic responsibilities. The paradox of knowledge is therefore an organizing theme for a life of inquiry. It shapes how one learns, how one teaches, how institutions are structured, how tools are built, and how ethics is practiced. It invites a posture that is both ambitious and modest, that seeks clarity without mistaking clarity for completion. It encourages practices that preserve curiosity, stoke wonder, and institutionalize methods that convert error into information rather than into dogma. In the private interior, the paradox can be a companion that soothes as well as provokes. The awareness that certainty will shift invites a softer relation to belief, a readiness to revise, and the courage to hold provisional convictions with openness. It permits action in the presence of doubt because the goal is not absolute finality, but progressive refinement. Living with the paradox is an admission that life is less about arriving and more about tending a conversation between the known and the unknown. This conversation remains endlessly engaging precisely because its horizon recedes. The receding horizon is not loss, it is invitation. Each step into knowledge makes the landscape more complex and more rich, and the ongoing expansion is itself a kind of abundance. For those who accept the paradox, the world offers inexhaustible material for curiosity, projects that span decades, collaborative webs that connect distant minds, and pleasures that are intellectual as much as aesthetic. The final recognition is graceful. Knowledge is a river that carries both revelation and uncertainty. It is an instrument of empowerment that also amplifies moral responsibility. It is an art of framing as well as a practice of verification. The paradox of knowledge therefore becomes a guide for how to devote attention, for how to cultivate institutions, for how to design tools, for how to live with courage in the presence of ignorance. To embrace the paradox is to be an agent of continuous discovery, to take joy in each small illumination, and to accept that every illumination will reveal more darkness beyond. Knowledge continues, the horizon continues to recede, and in that perpetual recession, the human mind finds a rhythm, a vocation, and a kind of joy. The paradox is not a problem to be solved once and for all. It is the shape of the enterprise itself, the condition that keeps inquiry alive. To be alive in this sense is to be engaged in that ongoing and generous labor, a labor of questioning, testing, learning, and then questioning again. The paradox remains, and it remains generous. It gives the mind forever new territory to explore and forever new reasons to be awake.